Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getItinwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
My guest is Charles Maynes. He is do you like to be defined mostly as a sound designer, or?
Yeah, probably that'd be
essentially
easiest.
Yeah. That's the brunt of your
Professional
history,
life,
your professional
I suppose,
life.
yeah.
But you come from a musician background, right?
Yes.
And you are, what's your main instrument?
Nowadays, mainly keyboards.
Uh-huh.
Keyboards and synthesizers. Some piano, but I'm not really a great pianist.
But you came from a rock and roll background, basically.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh. Totally. Started in punk rock. In the late '70s.
All right.
And basically graduated high school in 1980.
Uh-huh.
So I got to see all the awesome bands.
Perfect.
Early on.
Uh-huh. All right.
Ended up, basically going through the technology curve and being in the film and TV world mainly.
So tell me a little bit about that, because you and I were talking off camera before about coming up through like the early DigiDesign days and stuff
Sure.
like that. How did you go from punk rock to that?
Well, basically in high school, got into that thing.
The computer thing.
Well, not even the computer thing. That was actually kind of before the computer thing, because I graduated in 1980.
Okay.
So I was playing
Computers
in bands.
weren't really quite a thing yet, or at least personal computers.
Yeah, PCs were. There were some.
They were primitive.
Pretty.
Was it like Windows 3 or something like that?
Oh, I don't think that was MS-DOS. MS-DOS
Okay,
and
yeah,
CP/M.
yeah. Radio Shack computers. And
the
stuff.
TRS-80s. You had the K-Pros, which basically the only K-Pro experience I had was with it attached a little later to the digital keyboard Synergy.
Ooh, all right.
Which was Krumar's additive synth. Mm-hmm. But that was a number of years after that. So I was in punk rock bands. Did that. Kind of transitioned to post-punk, if you will. And
I'm amused at the dichotomy there between punk and computers.
Oh yeah.
The difference in the ethos there is kind of
Well, actually, in a figurative sense, it isn't as disconnected as you would think, and it was why I will try to make a narrative that makes sense to get to my next thing, which is essentially getting into digital synthesis.
Okay.
But it's like you go through the punk rock thing. It's all about rebellion, and whatever the status quo is
right.
wrong.
Okay,
and
sure.
you're reacting against it, or rebelling against it. So we did that, and played in bands. Ended up going to college, amazingly.
Oh, that's very unpunk right there.
Well, it's like my parents, wanted me to do something, and it was like, okay, well, I can do that. I ended up going to community college, studying audio engineering, which I was most interested in, and that ended up going into radio production, which I went from radio production into television production.
Interesting.
And it was it was a very weird thing, the way that the department was set up at that school, where, basically you could do not a bachelor's, but a associate's degree in, like audio production or video production. But you had to do basically all of the audio production to do the video production.
Sure. It was all under the moniker of broadcast.
Well, it was
I think, wasn't it?
telecommunications.
Yeah, telecommunications.
Yeah, it was actually
yes.
the department head or name. And oddly enough, it's like, I did that, basically completed the stuff, and then found that like, oh yeah, if I take 6 more courses, I can get a second degree in broadcast journalism. So I ended up with broadcast journalism and television production for associate's degrees. That led me to transfer to San Diego State University, where I wanted to do electronic music because they actually had a really neat lab for it. But I couldn't get in. It's like, I couldn't get into the telecommunications department because I didn't have the grades. So it's like, I took stuff. I was doing television production, but it's like I really didn't have an interest in getting into visual production. Like
you
film.
just didn't have an interest in the visual aspect of it, or the technology, or
For whatever reason,
didn't appeal.
it didn't attach to my interests.
Okay.
So, I mean, it seemed like, oh yeah, I could do that if I wanted a job. And I'm, coming from this, very standard nonconformist thing. So it's like, who needs a job? It's
Right.
like,
Right. I'm an artist.
Yeah, I'm an artist.
Yeah.
Which even that would have been hopeful. Compared to a lot of my friends. I mean, it's like I went to school with a composer here in LA named Roger Neal, who was extremely. When he was 16, you knew that he was going to be like the next Jeff Beck. He was just incredibly talented, and he still is incredibly talented. And it was like, okay, well, I have a pretty good sense I'm not going to end up where Roger's going to go, because he actually knows what he's doing, as opposed to me doing kind of a teen angst, explosion of emotion, kind of, presentation of music. So, it basically went to state, did a lot of electronic music stuff, but I couldn't make it into the telecommunications department, which is what would have been the most sensible thing for me to do. So I thought, okay, well, this kind of sucks. It's like, getting a bachelor's is no fun.
Right.
It's like I have to actually work at this.
Yeah.
So at the time I was actually working in music stores. And when I was at the community college, I was working at a music store called Albert's Music City, which was like, a little, mom and pop-ish store. But,
Right.
we did, drums, keyboard, some keyboards,
Yeah.
mainly guitars and bass and drums.
The predecessors to what Guitar Center is now. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Guitar Center was around then, but Guitar
was
Center
different.
was actually like really uptown.
Okay.
It's like, that was like a cool place.
That was the big place. Okay.
Yeah, that's where you could like go and see a Prophet 5.
Oh, okay.
Or something like that.
Right.
Whereas, it's like we didn't have anything nearly that cool.
You had the cheesy beginner stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were an Ibanez dealer and a Tama dealer, which were probably and Gibson, Fender, which was, but Gibson and Fender will sell to anybody.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of like, if you can do the opening order, you can become a dealer.
Right.
So it was, it just wasn't a high profile kind of thing. But I was able to essentially somehow transition that through the band contacts I had into getting a job at this place called Musicians Repair Service, which was owned by Mike Kruitsky, who is now retired. Oh yeah, Mike is amazing. I mean, it's like he is the guy I probably owe more to than almost anybody as far as ending up where I did. And basically, he ended up hiring me, but it was through a bizarre set of circumstances where this was like in 1984, I think, or 85. Oh no, actually, I take it back. It was 1986 because I had gotten married, which I got married pretty young. And when I was working with this one band, which actually had some traction in San Diego, we got on the radio and stuff. And our biggest high point was being able to open for Duran Duran on the Seven and Ragged Tiger tour in San Diego, which was really funny because basically Checkered Past was supposed to open for them and never showed up.
Nice.
So it was like, we were recording. Yeah, we were recording an EP at the time at this recording studio we had a small development deal with, and we got a call at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon saying, hey, it's like Checkered Past is supposed to be doing this show, but we haven't heard from them. And, why don't you guys come down and just wait, and we'll know at 4 p.m. whether or not you're going to do it or not.
Wow.
So we, waited for 3 hours, down in the bowels of the San Diego Sports Arena, and ended up getting the show, and being able to do it. And the thing that was super, super insane was like we got off stage and Checkered Past was there. And they were there with the Go-Go's and additional members of Blondie.
Ooh.
So it's like, Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols, Clem Burke, I'm trying to think who else was in Checkered Past, Michael DeBar, and I want to say it might have been Blondie's bass player, Nigel. And then like Frank Infanti from Blondie was there. They had all of the Go-Go's with them. And it's like, we're just like going, this cannot go well.
Awkward.
Awkward, yeah. And, we ended up, talking with like Frank and Fonte and some of the other people, and they were all really cool. And we just said, well, what happened? It's like, how did you, it's like, it's LA, LA to San Diego.
Right.
It's 2.5 hour drive. Granted it's tax day, but, that
still,
shouldn't have impacted traffic. So, yeah, we left at like, 10 a.m. and we just got here. And it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to believe in like, divine intervention, this is a pretty good case for it, because it doesn't take 10 hours, no matter if you have a school bus full of, crazy people.
Do it on a bicycle in 10 hours. I mean,
exactly. So it was weird, but it was a great show. And, so through that, basically in this band, we were recording with a friend of ours in El Cajon who had other bands that were really cool. And his brother was playing in a band called the Hitmakers in the UK. And he had sent this video to Jeff Kamak, who was our friend who was recording us, of Peter Gabriel on the South Bank show. And it was a documentary segment they did on him recording Security. And basically in one of the little scenes, they had him recording stuff for the Fairlight. And I thought, oh my God, it's like, that, it's like I was into music concrete and all of that stuff. When I was at school, and seeing him triggering like a television tube break on a musical keyboard, it was like seeing fire for the first time.
Yeah.
It was just like my world is it's like I don't even have words to describe how amazing this is.
And then being able to manipulate those sounds. Oh my God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, basically seeing that led me to like getting my parents to co-sign on a loan for me to buy an emulator 2.
Whoa.
Which was,
it was like several grand at that point.
It was
right?
like $7,000.
And
I had
in 1980s dollars.
1984 or 1986 dollars.
Yeah. Okay.
And
it's a lot of money.
Yeah. It was a lot of money. Basically, Mike Kruitsky sold it to me because he was the emulator dealer in town. And started doing a bunch of stuff on it, and I guess he thought I became pretty good on it, so he hired me to sell keyboards for him and develop sounds for the emulator. Because back then, there was a thing that EMI used to do called these emulator swap parties, where you would get together with other emulator users and trade discs.
Oh, cool.
So
basically sound sharing, so to
sound
speak.
sharing, and it's like, I ended up, meeting like Andrew Robinson from New Order, who was their keyboard tech through that. And, when I was at State, bands would come and play at the college. And, if I knew that they were emulator users, I would just go down like during the day when they were doing setup and say, hey, can I talk to your keyboard tech? And, would you be interested in trading some emulator sounds?
Cool.
And usually
it's a great way in.
Yeah, usually they were into it, and it's like it basically opened doors that really probably never would have been opened. For a kid my age, I was like, I don't know, like 23.
Well, you came offering something.
Well, yeah. I mean, and it was it was unique.
Yes.
I mean, it was a relatively small community of users who were doing the stuff, and it was very experimental at the time too.
Right.
So I think that there was
anything goes in that sense.
Yeah. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, I have like the world's best oboe sound. It's like nobody was interested in that. It was like, I got sounds of like geese farting. It's like, oh no, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
It's like that's something we could use.
Well, that's where a lot of the old like the German industrial punk and stuff came from.
Yeah. I mean, it was, again, taking the music concrete ideas of like Stockhausen and, even Pierre Boulez and stuff, we're doing, these, odd noises inside of music.
But putting a beat to it, basically, if you think about it. I mean, putting a very strong beat to it, but essentially that's what it was. It was just taking that music concrete art form.
Right.
And
blending it in, essentially tying it to disco. Because, it's like a lot of it was very dance-oriented.
Yeah.
And
although I would say also there come in your punk roots.
Oh yeah, well I mean it was kind of funny. We in this one band that played with Duran Duran, we opened for like so many bands in San Diego because we were kind of electronic, and we were like one of the only electronic bands down there. So it was like, if certain acts would come, we would get a first call because we would be seen as compatible on a bill. And we ended up opening for Ministry on their first tour.
Damn.
And it was like we opened for like Nina Hagen twice. We Icicle Works. There was a flock of seagulls, just a ton of bands.
Yeah.
But when Ministry played, it was like, this was for the With Sympathy album, which is the one that was on Arista that, Al Jorgensen famously, I think, burned the masters of because he was so upset with, essentially what they did with it. But he was, it's like he was super, super nice to us. It's like he had no need to be nice to us. And that was always a thing that like, really kind of, made an impact on me, throughout my career was like, okay, well, for one, it doesn't cost anything to help somebody.
Yeah.
It's like, if you can help somebody achieve, their own degree of success, you can never look at that as being, a threat to your own success.
I've always felt that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's something that I take very, very seriously. So, it's like, having that experience where it's like, okay, well, Ministry we thought was cool. I mean, they were still on their way up, but, it's just like, oh, this is, so this is the way artists work, because we didn't really see that quite as much, and, in the tier that we sat in.
Sure.
It was much more competitive. So, it just kind of pushed me more into, being into the electronic stuff. And then when I was going to say like with the emulator, that was very I don't want to say anti-tech or technique, but it's like, when people were using samplers, it became less about your physical skill as a musician as opposed to your kind of production aesthetic.
Yes, I could see that. Although, in a sense, I think especially, you mentioned earlier that you don't consider yourself that much of a pianist or keyboard player per se. And I think taking an instrument like that, it alters your approach to it so that you're not trying to approach it like a traditional piano per se.
And you really can't.
No.
Because it really doesn't, lend itself to it easily. And Mike, Mike was an amazing keyboardist. It's like he's really good.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's an excellent keyboardist.
I know when I was down at his place, I mean, he had a ton of synths all over the walls.
Amazing setup.
Yeah.
And that was always inspiring to me because it's like I was really into electronic instruments. And it's like at his shop, I saw my first PPG. For instance, which was, around 1985 or 1986-ish, after I got hired, somebody had one that they were consigning.
Yeah.
But,
In fact, I met Mike because he had one of the first Aphex units.
Oh, wow.
And I was interviewing him for Aphex.
Wow.
So it goes back quite a ways. It was one of my early interviews, in fact. But I remember him being very, very cutting edge in terms of his perspective on gear.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I first met him, before I started working with him, he had a band that played around town who was, all of the guys were good musicians. But they were kind of doing Genesis type stuff. He was a big Tony Banks fan, or is a big Tony Banks fan. So he had and they all had great gear.
Of course.
So it's like the drummer, who I forget his last name. It might have been Jeff something. He had like one of the first Simmons SDS5 kits that I'd seen. And Mike had I think at that time he had a CP70. He loved the Rhodes Chroma, which is an amazing machine, and an OBXA, and I think that might have been what his main synths were that he kind of went out with and played.
It's quite a setup.
Oh yeah, and it's like basically Musicians Repair was a sequential dealer or sequential circuits dealer. Oberheim dealer, 360 systems. We did all the high-end stuff.
Sure.
The Guitar Center didn't. But we had Roland to a small degree. We did Kuai early on. And then...
Kurzweil?
We didn't have Kurzweil. Kurzweil, it was very interesting. There was another pro audio shop in San Diego called New World Audio, which did mainly studio gear. And one of the guy who was kind of the shop manager at Musicians Repair, Scott Garside, ended up moving.
Scott too. He
Yeah,
used to work
Scott
for Mackie.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
He ended up going to New World,
Uh-huh.
and they were the Kurzweil dealer.
Uh-huh.
So there was a huge rivalry because basically
Sure.
we were the competing high-end dealers.
Yeah.
But Scott is amazing, and it's like I remember
Very talented guy. Yeah.
well, a great bass player, and it's like just a super sweet guy. And it was just kind of incredible. At the time, I was again really young, but it's like I had no idea of the impact that like Scott and Mike and Dave Paviel, who was he was the service manager, would have, like just in shaping my worldview. It's like they had such a giant influence. And I think it was largely because, they all were, very confident in who they were.
Uh-huh.
It's like, none of them saw themselves as being, great people. I mean, they were really nice people, but, it's like they just took their lives seriously.
Interesting.
And it's like, wow, it's like, for somebody coming from a, anti-authority kind of thing, it's like, I'm getting comfortable with that authority because these guys, guys walk the walk.
Yes.
It's not, it's not a sham.
Yeah.
So, you can edit that out, but
I think that's interesting.
I worship the ground that all those three guys walked on without any reservation.
Well, I mean, it's funny actually because when Scott was at Mackie, I was at Tascam, and I think we ran into each other a few times, like at Music Messa and stuff like that. And there was a rivalry there too because both companies were coming out with the same hard disk recorders at the same time and stuff like that. It was interesting. So let me take this opportunity though to now. Not necessarily redirect, but veer around a hairpin turn here and say, let's talk about how that then evolved into, how did that turn into an opportunity to, I mean, I understand the idea of you started out designing sounds, so therefore you ended up in designing sounds, but how did you go from being in bands and doing it musically to then, especially with having previously eschewed the idea of visuals, end up doing so much with movies and that must have been also sort of a gradual evolution, right?
Well, it was a gradual evolution, and to unhairpin that turn, which I'll hopefully not digress too much. When I was with Mike, basically, I started developing sounds for the emulator.
Right.
So that ended up getting us in the radar of Optical Media.
Okay.
Who was doing the CD-ROM libraries.
The CD-ROM libraries, yes.
So, I was contributing to their releases, and we became dealers for Optical Media. And
so you were double dipping.
Well, I mean, I wasn't
really,
making money though from the sounds. That was the thing that was so weird.
Really?
Like, we were just like giving them the sounds, because we thought it was a cool thing to do.
So you hadn't figured out that you could actually license that stuff yet.
Oh yeah. This was like way before that.
Okay.
And so we were doing that, and then also in the absolute spirit of contrarianism, when the DX7 happened, it caused such a stir in the music community that it was like everybody looked at it as though it was AI.
Yes.
It was that threatening to the status quo of synthesizers.
Well, because it was on every track.
Well, it was on every track, but it was so different.
Yeah, it was.
In its approach to developing sounds, and like the physical interface of the instrument was no knobs. It's like in one slider. Well, see, it's like when I saw it, I said, everything in my life is fulfilled with this instrument.
Really?
Because it's so contrary.
Yeah, okay, I could see that. I could see that, yeah.
And it was one of those things where it's like, I started, really trying to figure it out.
Well, you must have loved the Rhodes Chroma too then.
Well, the Chroma was something I never really got deeply into, but it's like, it was actually...
But the interface on that was also really weird.
It was really weird.
Yeah.
It was really weird.
It was also contrarian, I would say. Compared to
everything else.
Yeah, because everything else had, you want something, you grab a knob,
had a flow
LFO, whatever,
Yeah.
But this had menus, and the whole idea of menus, that's same thing with the DX7.
Yeah.
It's like, menus were a new thing.
Yeah, it was like, as soon as, basically got into digital control, I looked at something like the Expander to be like kind of a great expression of that transition.
Okay.
Because you've got so many potential things to do with it with a relatively small number of controls.
Yes.
And you really had to have an idea of how you wanted to make a sound. So it actually took you back to modular synthesis thinking. In the sense that like, okay, well, I want this sort of thing to happen. So I need to know that I can grab envelope 4 and patch it to LFO speed and have that governed by velocity. And then, as a secondary, controller, pressure, or something like that. And that would get me this crazy thing that I'd never heard before.
So again, the recurring theme here is having a goal. Having a defined goal, or at least...
I would never have been able to enunciate it at that time.
Right.
I was
Right.
just being contrary. It's
But
like
that's a precursor to that in a way, isn't it?
well,
if you think about it.
it's funny because like with the instrumental side of things, it's like, I eschewed stuff that on keyboard was technically demanding, but I wrote it off as being, that's not what I want to do because everybody else is doing it. So I have to say, like, I want to say like 10 years ago, or no, probably 15 years ago, I got really into Bach, which I'd never been into before. It's like I kind of rejected like a lot of, classical keyboard music. And my mom was actually a concert pianist, which was kind of ironic.
Well, makes sense.
And she could never get me to take piano lessons. It's like I became a drummer in the bands. So again, contrarianism. But it was one of those things where it's like once I could appreciate what harmony was, it was like, okay, now I have a goal. It's like, like when I was in the Steven Wilson stuff, it's like, okay, it's like, you go and, pick up a chart of his things and, you look at like, all the chords that are being used. And it's like, oh my God, it's like, he's literally, and now, it's like in my compositions, I'm like running into the same thing where it's like, okay, I've used every key in this song. And it's like, it all makes sense, but it's almost like working through a more of a symphonic composition as opposed to a song. So then you have to, and this goes, sadly, when I mentioned Randy Tom, one of the most important comments in my book of Randy's, which he has an encyclopedia of insightful, it's like he could essentially provide the modern sound designer's book of Psalms, in my opinion, or, Songs of Solomon, where it's like, there's thousands of tidbits that he's, dropped over the years that are so incredibly insightful and timeless, and you can apply to so many different situations. But one regarding mixing was that basically, all processes of the sound editing art is about editing, and it's about removing as opposed to adding.
It is subtractive, absolutely. And that, I was just thinking that when you were saying that so much of it is we pile on all these ideas, and then we have to wade through them and remove them. And, it's hard in a way because we get attached to a certain idea. We have to remind ourselves that ideas in themselves are cheap. If you're at your last one, you're in trouble. And I think it's a matter of, okay, maybe I should file that over there and try it for something else later.
Well, it's like, it's like I've been writing a lot of stuff, music, now when I'm doing, like improvisations and things like that, and it's like I'm working through, trying to build songs and write songs. It's like, okay, it's like I'm going to write down all this stuff, in my notebooks, and then,
for later.
It's like, the ideas rhythmically or contextually that I'm, doing these passages in when I'm writing them, I might entirely go 180 degrees different the next time I visit it and end up with something that I think is more compelling. Even though it wasn't in my thinking at the time I was, working through the chord passages.
Oh, I'm a firm believer in most of the creative process occurring without the execution. The execution is the documenting of all the stuff that's been sort of bubbling under
Right.
in your unconscious or subconscious,
Well,
whatever.
I look at it very similar to you know, writing. You know, where it's like, you know, basically, you know, I mean, I write for the MPSE journal. I'm on the board of directors for it, and a part of the team that does, we have a quarterly journal, and we write a lot. Yeah, I mean, I write, you know, usually, you know, 2 feature articles per issue, and you know, it's like in writing it, it's like you prepare your questions you want to ask your subject,
Yes.
and then you get their responses back, and then you start seeing how you can arrange this material in a manner that has a narrative that's compelling.
Yes.
You know, and I'm always thinking, you know, again, to an end result of like, okay, well, what is the MPSE membership going to want to hear about
Yes.
from this person? Because, you know, it's like they you know, obviously if they made it to the point where we're writing something about them, they have something that the membership is going to probably be interested in to begin with.
Sure.
So, you know, it's like I'm going to be doing an article later this year on Johnny Byrne, who did the sound for Zone of Interest. And, you know, I know, it's like, for one, you know, the subject matter is extremely interesting to me. The way that the film was developed was extremely interesting, in the sense that, you know, we don't have many films that we see, or television shows that we see, that essentially can be as though they were being done as a stage play, but having, you know, like this depth of resonance that is not seen by the viewer, you know, that's essentially informing all of the actions they are seeing.
Yeah.
You know, which is what, you know, Zone of Interest, you know, I thought was just such an amazing piece of work, because it was so unsettling. You know, it's like, you know, you had certain qualities of the image that you knew horrible things were happening, but you never saw horrible things happening. You know, in fact, I was talking with the editor of the journal, Chris Horgan, about this, where, you know, the thing that's very interesting about it is they did not need to tell Schindler's List again. It's like, it's like, you go into that film with the expectation of like, you probably
Bad
saw
news.
Schindler's List.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, it's like, you know everything that led to...
You know that, yeah. You basically know going in what you're going to get.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, you know, they didn't need to retell that aspect of the storytelling.
I see what you're saying.
You know, which is just, you know, it's like, I think that is true high art.
Oh, absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting you just mentioned that. It made me think of the art of the interview, because when you were talking about writing the questions, you know, I'm very into choice architecture.
Sure.
You know, and one of the things that is a challenge, and an interesting challenge for me in doing interviews, and I've done 150 episodes of this.
Sure.
I've done, you know, countless hundreds of other interviews for clients and whatnot. And I've always been fascinated with the great interviewers. You know, Dick Cavett was a masterful one.
Sure.
Who, there's an art form there to asking the right questions, but also letting the answers just come out and letting them go wherever they go. So there's a balance there between the goal-oriented aspect that you're talking about and the idea of letting it be free-flowing and unfolding in a certain amount of spontaneity in order to get the person to open up. So there's a balance there.
Well, I think the thing that's particularly of interest to me is that in that process, I think you get to essentially the motivations which led to the decisions that were made that are so compelling now.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
know? I mean, for whatever reason, like when you were mentioning that and we were talking about it, I kept thinking of this amazing performance of Comfortably Numb that David Gilmour had David Bowie sing on.
I haven't seen
playing
that one.
the Roger Waters, you know, vocal. And how unexpected it was. You know, it's like I wouldn't have expected David Bowie to do that. And this was, you know, relatively close to his death.
I could see him pulling it off a very interesting version of it, though.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
I have to
because
look
it's
for
like,
that.
you know, it has this intimacy to it. I mean, the song is an amazing song.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, I would say it's almost, you know, a pinnacle of Pink Floyd's output.
It's beautifully hypnotic. It's
Right.
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And you would think, like, you know, in The Wall, which is, you know, the album that it's on, that it's somehow entirely the antithesis
Exactly.
of it.
It is almost out of context, and yet it makes sense in the storyline.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the bizarre hopefulness,
Yeah.
or I should say hopelessness, you know, of, you know, like wanting to essentially disconnect
Resignation.
from the cruelty of the world.
Yes.
You know, which, yeah, again, you know, it's like when you're doing these interviews, you know, it's like you get answers. Like, you know, you can ask me a particular detail about something that's more factual,
Right.
and, you know, it's like I could tell you that answer, but then, you know, to arrive at the motivations which led to, you know, the action reaction, you know, kind of, you know, curve that, you know, led to whatever outcome it was, I think is really, really interesting.
You have to let that unfold.
Oh, totally.
That's the thing. And you know, sometimes it goes where you think it will, and sometimes it doesn't, you know.
Absolutely.
Which is the same thing with writing, composing, creating in any sense. You know, you set yourself a general goal, but the more specific you are in certain ways, the more challenging it is to actually create something.
Right.
You have to be ready for those accidents, and you have to be ready for that, how shall we say, the intervention of the collective subconscious, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's the ideas just flow.
Yeah.
You know, and they're birthed in that way, I think.
Yeah, and you know, so much of it is, you know, is tied contextually speaking to the era that the thing happens in.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
yeah.
you know, you look at you know, the differences between, you know, like Gershwin's "I Got Rhythm" and "Summertime." You know, and you see like two radically different kind of feelings in music. And I mean, Gershwin was, you know, another one of those brilliant composers who,
absolutely.
you know, basically, you know, could run the gamut from, you know, Broadway stuff to, you know, American in Paris.
Total savant.
You know, I mean, you just you listen to the body, or it's like Bach, you know, or Mozart, you know, where it's just like, and it's odd because Mozart, I think, in some ways is actually to a degree a little bit of a lesser, because the feeling of his music tended to be more homogenous.
I think, yeah, you know, I mean, again, we're speculating here, but I think if I would equate them to modern times, I think Bach was way more ADHD and way more on the spectrum, whereas Mozart was much more focused and you know, and I think, you know, because, you know, you go back to a lot of these very, very hyper creative people, Leonardo da Vinci, you know, for example.
Oh yeah.
So multifaceted, you know, inventor and painter and musician and all of it, you know, and I think, again, that multifacetedness, it's a blessing and a curse. It's a superpower, and at the same time, it can be completely incapacitating.
Well, it's weird because, you know, I mean, you know, in my journey, you know, it's like, you know, you were saying, you know, to redo the 180, you know, how did you get into the visual media? You know, which is something that was unexpected for me. You know, it's like I went through, you know, I was doing, you know, sound development, and then essentially got into software development. And that was, you know, driven largely by concerns that were outside of that universe. I didn't have a desire to go to work at DigiDesign, in the sense, I mean, I knew people there who I really liked, but I didn't have a burning desire to do software.
It was just following the path and building the bridge as you walked, basically.
Well, honestly, it was one of those things where it's like, you know, we wanted to start our family, and the company I was working at was not a good fit for it. We didn't have healthcare. We didn't have any of the things, the supports that were needed. And, you know, the opportunity came, you know, to you know, be a part of DigiDesign, which was one of the best experiences in my life. And, you know, it had the supports that we needed to be able to do that part of our journey, my wife's and mine. And it ended up opening up a phenomenal amount of doors, which I never in my wildest imagination would have anticipated.
Sure.
It's like, basically, I was on the customer support line for 2 years there, supporting everything from, sound designer 2, when I started, sample cell we did, which was, I had, working with samplers, I had a fairly good understanding of that stuff, and MIDI and, the mechanics of musical electronics at the time. And, then having Pro Tools, happen, which was, quite an amazing experience. I mean, where it is now, I would probably guess nobody at DigiDesign would have imagined.
Oh, of course not.
How far it's gone.
Of course.
And it's very interesting because getting into those technological philosophy things. One of the things that I think about a lot is Moore's law. Because it's like,
Yes.
when I started, it was very fascinating because, once I got into DigiDesign, it was a very, very encouraging environment to explore. So it's like, I got more into doing computer stuff when
Sure.
I was there because it's like it became what I did on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
So, it's like learning about, programming languages and things of that sort. Something that, again, I didn't really anticipate I'd ever really be that into. But it was sort of like, okay, well, I want to have a deeper relationship with my coworkers. And I know that if I do this, it's going to allow me to have a better understanding of what's important to them.
Yeah, it helps when you get the jokes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, it's like definitely, at that point in time with Digi, I think it was like, I want to say it was higher like 62.
Wow, okay.
When we were down in Menlo Park, this was on Willow Road,
Yep.
which we shared. We were in the same business park as Studer Diaxis, which was kind of amusing. But, it was one of those things where it's like, you're being exposed to people of such intellectual stature, who don't use that against, it's like they would not ever use their intellect to hurt somebody.
Right.
But,
Right.
Like Peter Gocher,
Yes.
amazing person. Evan Brooks, absolute genius.
Yeah.
Mark Jeffrey, who was, the lead programmer for Pro Tools for, most of its lifetime. He just left the company last year.
As you say, generous people in that sense, generous with their wisdom.
Time, wisdom,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Peter, Peter was extremely approachable. I mean, he ended up being the person who was my final interview when I got hired there. And to think that, the CEO or the top person in the organization was going to be, doing it. Well, maybe actually it probably made a huge amount of sense since I was going to be basically an outward facing,
Yes.
person in their organization, talking to their end users. But, it's like he was just a really generous and nice person. Paul Lego, who was our CEO, was amazing. Every person there was so great to be around. It was like such an incredible family, operation.
And obviously led to a lot of other relationships and opportunities and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, so many companies, were, I don't want to say spun out of it, but like, Colin McDowell, who does McDSP, he was a software engineer there.
Yes.
When we did Pro Tools 1, we were working in conjunction with both OSC, who kind of came out of Blank Software, who did the Alchemy sample editing program. Andrew Calvo, who was my contact to get hired, was Peter's assistant at the time. He was at Blank Software. Mats Meyerberg, who was the lead programmer for OSC, ended up at Microsoft. And then, Mats worked at Blank Software as well. David Willenbrink was we need to end?
No.
David
fault.
Willenbrink was another one who was, one of the lead programmers at Blank who contributed heavily to Pro Tools. And then we have the ties to Opcode.
Right, of course.
Which, obviously Dave Oppenheimer has been involved with Pro Tools now for 25 years. but getting to become a part of the Opcode family, because it's
Yeah.
like I had friends who worked there, and I did some development work on the Max program with David Ziccarelli, which is now Cycling 74.
Yes.
So there was like a lot of cross connections.
Well, generally speaking, a lot of the opcode people ended up at Tascam.
Oh, sure.
I met a bunch of them there. I worked with a bunch of them there as well. We had a lot of the people who ended up going over to Mackie later on, Bob Tudor and that whole group, So there was definitely a lot of cross pollination.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, we had Mark Hiskey,
Sure.
who was, when C-Lab, was it? Yeah, I think C-Lab. He actually had space in the digital design offices, that he was basically doing his coding on, for, I think, when he was beginning to work on Logic.
Wow.
And then, people like Dave Bolt who ended up, being involved. He was, started out as a
I just talked to Dave a couple of weeks ago at NAB.
Yeah.
In fact, I was mentioning to him that I had been toying with moving from Final Cut to Resolve.
Oh, uh-huh.
And he introduced me to a couple of guys over there and took me through all of my, what ifs and, well, how do I, and this stuff, and I ended up talking to their public relations guy, their media relations guy. He loaned me a shuttle wheel to try out over the week. And
yeah, I think I saw you.
Yeah,
you sent pictures of that.
I'm loving it, man.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's very, and again, it's like unexpected connections through other people and everything, but that is how the path takes you,
Well, that's the thing, and ultimately, it's funny because with any kind of professional engagement we have, it ends up not being about. We have to have some measure of skill in what we do.
Yes.
But we don't necessarily have to be the absolute best at what we do. But we do have to be able to essentially have positive and constructive interactions with our peers.
Yes.
And I think it's like trying to describe that for people coming into the sound editing business, which is very difficult to break into. It's like I would always say you need to essentially get out and meet people. You need to you begin to have relationships with them, so that they can establish a level of trust in understanding your personality. And if they can, if you're going to be somebody who, can be thrown into the oven and won't wilt, versus somebody who basically shuts down when the first bit of adversity happens. I think that's, an extremely important skill.
It is, and I think that's interesting because you've started down the path that I was going to ask you as a concluding question, but let's take that full circle, because you did come into this industry through relationship making, which I absolutely believe is important.
Sure.
I believe it's also really important to be curious and be open. It's one of the reasons I do this show, is because I learn something from everyone I interview, but also because I'm genuinely interested in people.
Yeah.
So
there's
carrying
great
that
stories
forward,
out there.
Exactly. Everybody's got them.
Yeah.
And so carrying that forward, I know you've done some mentoring and stuff like that. You have 15-year-old you, full of rebellion, right? Coming into an industry now and a world now which has completely changed. The way we communicate, the way we ingest information, create, everything's different. Would you still give the same advice in terms of, obviously everybody's got their own path. Your path won't work for someone else, but what's different? What's different? What's still the same? What advice would you give 15-year-old you now?
I don't know that it would be that different. I think it's probably more refined.
Of course.
Because, age does that.
Hindsight.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the most important takeaway, I remember very distinctly when I decided that doing sound for films would be really cool. And that was after seeing Terminator 2.
All right.
Which I think is one of the best films ever made, action films ever made. And Gary Rydstrom is the pinnacle of heroes to me. It's like he is like the most awesome human that I think one of the most awesome humans I've ever had any encounters with in the industry. And his point of view is amazing. You know, I mean, it's like he has such, it's not, I mean, I'm sure, you know, Gary has such an amazingly focused aesthetic. And I think that the thing that most appealed to me in that film, and, you know, it's like, you know, then I got to see all the, you know, other, you know, started following Gary's work, you know, which is obviously without parallel. You know, his Academy Awards alone, you know, would suggest that it's without parallel. But the one thing I learned was, you know, pay attention to what you think is really, really good. You know, like, you know, learn what quality is for what we do with storytelling. You know, it's like, you know, I've had a lot of conversations lately about this where, you know, in the sound editing and mixing space, there's a lot of people who fixate a lot on tools and, you know, tools and techniques versus like
inspiration.
Well, inspiration is super important, but, you know, like, again, having an idea of what you want the output to look like, you know, what the finish line is going to be, at least inside of your head. You can't push your idea of what the finish line looks like onto other people, but at least you have something that you're thinking, you know, you want to achieve in the storytelling. And I think that's what it ultimately comes down to is, you know, figure out what you're trying to say and then try to say it as best you can. You know, whether it's music, whether it's, you know, making movies, whether it's writing, you know, it's like just try to make it, you know, the best distillation of the ideas that you are trying to convey. And, you know, in Randy's sense, in the sense of editorial, you know, it's like try to remove the bits that you don't like, you know, to do your best to like, well, actually, a quick shout out to one of my heroes, Tom Robinson, who's an English singer. He was a BBC presenter. He has a really amazing BBC talk he did about getting your music heard. And he was saying, you know, that, you know, basically it's very easy to get radio to hear your music. You know, it's like, you know, if you want to get on a radio, you know, if you want a DJ to hear you or, you know, like a programmer to hear you, that's not hard to have happen. The bad news is you only have about 30 seconds. So it's like, unless you knock their socks off in 30 seconds, you will become unwelcome. So make sure that when you give them that 30 seconds, it's the absolute best thing that you can give them. You know, and he said, you know, with bands, you know, it's like, you know, bands will come and they'll do demos and stuff and they'll immediately want to like get on the radio. And they're not going to understand that, like, okay, it might take more time that we don't understand how that's going to unfold in order for us to really have a better distillation of the story we're trying to tell.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Tom York, I think, is like one of the big people think of with this. Where, you know, it's like I listen to Radiohead and, you know, the Smile and, you know, and Johnny Greenwood stuff and just think, you know, I don't see how they ended up here. You know, it's like, you know, it's such a unique expression. And, you know, oftentimes there will be elements of familiarity inside of what they're expressing, but their end package ends up being something that is
completely different. Blue Nile's another one.
You know, I don't know if you saw, I think I posted a thing about you know, their first album,
Walk Across the Rooftops. I still have my copy.
I mean, I remember, you know, hearing that when I was at Mike's place. It was a good friend of mine who kind of, you know, helped get me hired there, was a big Blue Nile fan. And I think that there was, I forget how they kind of came into our radar. I think there was like some Peter Gabriel connection that they might have had. Because, like, you know, for me, you know, my big artists are, you know, like Steven Wilson, which I've gone on about far too much, but it can never be enough. You know, David Sylvian in Japan were giant, you know, influences for me. And Peter Gabriel, you know, that kind of, you know, art school, you know.
Joseph Arthur. You
I don't
familiar
know
with Joseph Arthur?
I do not know.
It was on Real World for about a minute.
Okay.
And I think he dropped off the label intentionally or something. But
Wow.
another one who's definitely all over the place, musically speaking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know the school that you're talking about, and it's the school of it shouldn't really be a hit, but somehow there's some appeal to it. There's the esoteric aspects of it
Right.
do somehow or another do not overpower the accessibility of it.
Well, there's a curious accessibility to
Yeah.
it, which I think is
Yeah.
very fascinating. In the sense of like you can listen to Blue Nile or Peter Gabriel. Well, Peter Gabriel is in his kind of rarefied
Yeah,
air.
yeah,
But Radiohead, David Sylvian, where you go, okay, I could see this coming. I can see that there's a potential Topanga Canyon influence.
Yeah.
Like from the '60s. Or
Yeah.
Joni Mitchell, or these titans of the folk music scene. Yet I don't know that I would necessarily classify them at all in the folk realm. And this would go for Radiohead even.
And, it's interesting because there's also this urban influence.
Oh, yeah.
Almost a New York influence. It's there's a Tom Verlaine aspect of it as
Oh, yeah.
well. There's all this mishmash. in
Yeah,
a way,
the Bowie. I mean, Bowie
Yeah.
is another giant influence for me.
And Total Chameleon.
Lou Reed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Coming out of the Velvet Underground stuff. The proto punk.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
The John Cage stuff, all of that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I
Not
think,
John Cage, John Cale. That's what
Well,
I'm
John
thinking.
Cale, yeah, which again is
Yeah.
kind of Velvet
Velvet
Underground
Underground stuff, yeah.
universe. Sonic Youth. You look at a lot of that stuff, and so much of that material is contrarian in its own way.
Yep.
That I think something that is fascinating to me is like most of those bands that I'm really really fond of, I think have a very literary or a
Yes.
literate
Yes.
kind of aesthetic.
Yeah. It's
Where
not
it's-
Baby Let's Dance. It's there's
Well,
substance to it.
they're talking about bigger concepts.
yeah, yeah.
And it's they're not looking for a simple answer.
Right.
Which I think is I think that's what really makes the stuff more enduring.
It's angst in the human condition a lot of times, It's
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, you look at stuff like Mark Hollis,
Yeah. Yeah.
who's another amazing example of that. I mean, I remember reading, I think it was in Stephen Wilson's autobiography, but I think he was talking, or it might have even been something Richard Barberi said. Who's the keyboardist in Porcupine Tree and was in Japan, and they were talking about the Rain Tree Crow project, which was the kind of post-Japan quasi-reuniting of the band, and they did this album that was very different from the sort of stuff that Japan did. And I think an interviewer was saying, oh yeah, it's like that sounds a lot like Mark Hollis's Talk later albums. And he said, oh yeah, we were listening to that stuff like crazy. And it's like the idea that you would want to classify that into that family is probably doing Mark Hollis an injustice.
Well, but it does go back to that whole cross-pollinization thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and really, honestly, artists tend to listen to everything,
Yeah.
And I mean, we have very eclectic tastes, and we may not always express them because we have a certain. Well, first of all, especially if you're a public-facing artist, you have a certain image, quote unquote, and then even as just a creative person, goes back to the whole thing again of setting goals, and I can set a goal to be all over the map, but therefore I'm going to be spread very thinly, and I'm not going to have the impact of if I set a goal of being here.
Right.
And I may end up here, but I'm still going to have an impact because I've focused.
Well, it's weird because I mean, I don't know. We should probably close this thing down. One of the people in the music industry who I find incredibly fascinating is Jeff Baxter. In the sense that he's this great guitarist. Doobie Brothers alumni.
Right.
Played on Steely Dan's albums and stuff. And he was doing like
Defense
missile
stuff.
stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. There was another guy like that too, passed away a few years ago, Stephen St. Croix.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, another one who was, a government agent, working for the government, doing missile stuff, and at the same time, amazing musician.
Right.
Again, goes to the multifaceted nature of who we
I think,
are and what
I
we
think
do.
it's that inquisitiveness that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's like I think that's really the key feature of a lot of these individuals is that they don't identify themselves as a musician, or they identify themselves as an artist in a very broad sense.
Yeah.
Or even as a human in a very broad sense.
Well, and in recent times, the term creative has become a noun, which I'm not necessarily fond of. But
it's a weird thing because it's like I think I think that it's become a catch-all.
Yeah.
In the sense that
I made something.
well, or at least I want people to think I made something.
Yeah.
Because a lot of executive people who are considered to be creatives, and this isn't to criticize that group, but a lot of the output ends up kind of becoming a little vanity-ish. In the sense of like, oh yeah, I want to, like the Elon Musk thing. It's like, Elon Musk is not an engineer. It's like,
Right.
He is a businessman.
He's a business
good
person.
He's a business manager, and, people have very strong opinions about him in all directions.
Yeah.
But, the thing that, is a fact is that he has essentially managed to construct a number of businesses which had very compelling outputs.
Yes, and he has a good, big picture aspect to him in
Right.
terms of understanding, building an ecosystem and everything. Again,
Right.
Whether you like him or not,
Right.
He has that talent, but he does not necessarily have the talent of being a quote unquote creative.
Right. I mean, it's like I think that he has, he has judgments, but for me, it's like to be perhaps less kind. I look at like the Cybertruck and go, I don't know how you guys arrived at this being a good idea.
Yeah,
and
if you've seen them up close,
Yeah.
they're really ugly, man.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, Teslas have a kind of a very curiously unique design.
Yeah.
In the way that they're configured. I don't know if I would say that I think it's particularly attractive, but I think there is enough orthodoxy in it that you would go, oh well, it looks like somebody who's used to making cars made that.
Yes.
Whereas like with the Cybertruck, it's like, it's like maybe your fourth grader shouldn't have designed the general shape of the contours because
I look at it and I think it reminds me of a PV logo.
yeah, the angular aspects
the
of
angular
it, are
aspect.
just it makes you feel uncomfortable.
It does, and it's a statement. We don't have to go there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's like, people see them as status symbols, which is, that's my understanding, dropping $70 to $100,000 on a car in general is,
Sure.
you're looking for status.
I mean, same thing with Hummers.
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, Hummers are weird because, it's like, I think that there was a identity thing. That,
There was. It was a
people-
macho thing because it was derived from the military, etc.
styled.
Yeah.
Which Americans tend to have issues with more so than other cultures, but it is also in other cultures too. I mean, you look at a Mercedes Unimog, which I think is actually kind of a cool vehicle.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like, okay, well, that's something I would expect to see in a dystopian story.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
yeah.
like that's
a Mad Max kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's like clearly that is a form follows function device.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's it's not designed to look pretty. It's designed to be able to do
Right. Exactly.
whatever it does.
Yeah. Drive across a river or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's pretty wild. But on the artistic side, you look at it and you go, we want to make art. We want to be able to do human expression and make things that things that we can be happy with.
Yes,
I mean, I think
as
that's
creative artists, we want to be happy with what we're doing. And maybe that's a good way to wrap this, is to say, define success as an artist.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it doesn't have to do with commercial sales, although obviously it's equated with that.
Yeah.
But
well, there's a business.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is like, it's called the entertainment business.
Exactly.
It's not called, even in the art business, if you will.
Yeah.
I mean,
are you selling paintings,
yeah,
or whatever?
Well, if you're SF MoMA or LACMA or whatever, it's like there are expenses required to essentially be able to be there.
Sure. And to get a display in a gallery.
Oh yeah.
An exhibit in a gallery, for example.
Yeah.
It all of that comes down to the commercial aspect the same way selling records does.
Oh, totally.
But at the same time, are you successful as an artist? How is that defined? That's defined by your own satisfaction with it.
Well, yeah. Well, I think you in an emotional sense, you have an obligation to at least do something that's pleasing to you.
Yeah.
I think the problem in general that I'm seeing, because I've had a lot of conversations about this with software design, where you end up doing things without an idea of how the business works.
Yes.
In the sense that it's like, I'm going to make this cool invention, and making a cool invention on its own is awesome. It's like there's nothing wrong about that. Where things tend to go problematic is when people have expectations for exploitation of that idea.
Yes.
And
who needs this invention?
Well, who needs it? And also, it's like, how do I create a platform which is essentially going to be sustaining? Because I mean, you look at how many software applications and plugins and things over the course of the last 30 years came and went. You know, I mean, I remember when I was at Mike's, we used to use the Southworth software, MIDI Paint, or Total Music and MIDI Paint, and then there's a thing on One Step, and they had amazing features, but essentially, ultimately, the features were less attractive to their user base, so they ended up not being able to sustain their businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you look at Opcode, another great example. Had fantastic products, but essentially, they hit a wall as far as the way that they could exploit the business, so they sold, and and then it sold to Gibson, which in hindsight we know was a bad idea.
Every synthesizer manufacturer, Moog,
Sequential
Circuits, Oberheim, same thing.
Right.
They all basically, they were very creative individuals. They came up with wonderful ideas. Mm-hmm. Their business sense was not ideal.
Well, I mean, I think that the problem is that, and it's I think we're going to see a second wave of it happen now, because it's like we've gotten so boutique centric in so many of the pro audio sphere products, where and even in some software situations where you have one person who is essentially making the thing happen.
Yeah.
And if that person falls down a manhole, what happens then?
Yep. Yeah, we've seen that. We've seen that on a number of occasions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's weird though, because it's like you end up with products which have a big following, and then essentially those companies cannot sustain. I'm trying to think. Well, when we saw the subscription model emerge, with software, it was like much of the population really was very upset about it. Because we had the idea of this permanence. It's like we're buying a license, and now we shouldn't have to pay again.
Right. We should have it forever.
Yeah, it should it should be like buying a piece of hardware.
Right.
I buy a guitar pedal, and it's like, I don't have to buy it again. I mean, I might buy another one.
But it doesn't evolve.
But it doesn't, and I don't have to worry about let's just say I have a Boss pedal, because everybody knows Boss pedals. It runs on 9-volt batteries, and let's say that they didn't have a wall adapter. So let's just say it ran just on 9-volt batteries. We don't have to worry about 9-volt batteries going away.
Right.
It's like we have a pretty good sense that, for the foreseeable future, we're always going to be able to get a 9-volt battery to make this thing go. you know, as opposed to with software, you know, like when Apple Silicon happened. You know, there were developers who said, you know what,
went by the wayside.
We're done.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, we do not have the resources to recode everything to make this next step. So, you know, thanks for the memories, and, you know, we'll see you next time.
But, you know, that's kind of apples to oranges if you think about it, because you buy a Boss pedal, that Boss pedal is not going to evolve, get new features,
Oh,
etc.
no, it's going to be locked in. It's like buying a Lexicon, you know, reverb.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Whereas, you know, anything that can be updated and upgraded and evolve,
Sure.
you know, I have to say, you know, the creator of that product does have the right then to want to charge for those updates.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I and that's, you know, basically, you know, I mean, I've had some conversations about copy protection regarding this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Where, you know, it's like, okay, you know, some people feel very strongly about, you know, copy protection being very, very inhibiting in what they do.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, I get that. It's like, you know,
Depends on the implementation.
Well, most of the arguments I've seen is because it's inconvenient.
Of course,
know?
yeah.
So, you know, it's inconvenient because I want to use my laptop and I don't want to have a bunch of shit dangling off
Right,
of it.
and I don't want my iLock and all that stuff.
Yeah, all that stuff, you know, is you know, encroaching on my flexibility.
Right.
And it's sort of like, okay, you know, I get, you know, your need for flexibility. However, there is a need for that software vendor to feel confident that essentially he's going to be compensated for his product when it's being used.
Right. You're not creating in a vacuum. It's the same thing like if I get in a car and I want to get from here to San Diego, I could drive 150 miles an hour if I had the right car, but I would be jeopardizing the safety of others.
Oh, sure.
So I have to be, you know, I have to...
You're working in a collaborative social construct.
And that's what this is too, if you think about it. You know, we have to meet the needs of the software developer as well as the artist.
Yeah.
So, makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, like, I think, you know, I would like to see people give more consideration to, you know, like both sides of those
Absolutely.
thought. You know, because it's like, you know, if we don't support, you know, the developers who are creating all these new nice things, you know, why should they feel compelled to, you know, continue developing nice things?
Yeah. Well, you know, this is the argument we're going through about musicians right now too. You know, if you don't make it worth their while to create art, you know. We could go round and round here forever. I can see that. So we probably just have to like wrap this in, you know, inelegantly.
We can wrap this up inelegantly. You know, it was really fun to be able to chat about these things.
Charles Maynes, thank you for being my guest.
Indeed,
it has been a pleasure,
Very good,
I'm sure this will be all over the map. So you know, hell with it. Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.